Hey everyone, Attorney Davis Younts here. This year for the 4th of July, we wanted to do a short 5-video series. We're just going to talk about different elements of the way we think about this holiday, both as Americans and Christians, and how that impacts the way we celebrate. So stay tuned to our YouTube channel and to our social media this week as we begin to think about how we celebrate this holiday well, and check out our video series. Thanks. Take care. Everyone, Attorney Davis Younts here. Listen, this is the day 2 in our 4th of July video series where we're talking about just some concepts and really going to get into some fun things about the 4th of July. But my goal is just, with everything going on in the world, how do we think about, how do we focus on this holiday, not just as Americans, but as Christians? How does it impact the way we celebrate? And how do we have meaningful celebrations? So what I wanted to talk about in this second video is I wanted to just ask the question, were the founders right? Was their decision to rebel against the king a biblically justified moral and ethical decision? Now, we as Americans, I think often we just sort of take that for granted, and we don't necessarily go into deep thought about it. And there's a perspective. I remember going to Philadelphia, going to Independence Hall as a kid, probably 4th grade, and getting a tour. And I remember the park ranger there talking about the idea that the founders were rebels and criminals. And he sort of gave a British perspective on the Revolutionary War and talked a little bit about what did the king think? What did the British people think of these rebellious, ungrateful colonists? So as we think about that, there's things that we deal with in society today, and we think about, were they evil men? Should we cancel them historically or not? And what I want to submit to you as we go through this today, what I'm really going to talk about is whether or not their decision to go to war, to engage in warfare, meaning the taking of life in order to gain freedom and independence for the American colonies. So I just want to start by framing it this way. I don't think we can understand the Revolutionary War and where America was at, where the colonies were at that time, without the Great Awakening. Understand the Great Awakening was a revival of people coming to Christ, accepting Christ, and really it was a return to theology and a deep understanding of theology and how Christ applies to all of life. So I personally don't believe we would have seen an American Revolution. We wouldn't have had the founders without the Great Awakening. And that brought about things like the Black Robe Regiment. And if you've heard of that, that was this idea that there were these pastors and ministers that were not only preaching that the war was biblically justified, they were articulating and arguing those points, but as well willing to take up arms themselves if necessary. So the best way to frame this now is just to take a step back and say, okay, what is just war theory generally? And were the founders just in their actions? So I just this is going to be really high level just to get you thinking. If you want to go deeper on this, there's a lot of great resources. My favorite resource for just war theory comes from Greg Bahnsen. I think he did an excellent job talking about this and kind of articulating the elements of just war theory. So here's what we are. When we think about just war, we start with cause and intent. So think of whether or not this action, this military action, this war-like action is just in cause and intent. In other words, is it righteous in the eyes of God? So the primary purpose must be defensive. It must be aimed at protecting the innocent and preserving law and order. So war should never be started as an act of conquest, aggression, or spreading an ideology. So the question then is, were the leaders in America, were America's civic leaders, think of them as lesser magistrates, and that's kind of a longer conversation for another time, were they justified, these elected colonial leaders, were they justified in their cause for war and their intent? And I think the answer is yes. They were looking at oppression by a king that was denying basic inalienable rights from its citizenship, and their intent was freedom and independence if necessary to gain back God-given rights, and it was defensive. They were looking to protect themselves, their families, and they're right. So I think there is a pretty good argument. We have a just cause and intent. The next is legitimate authority. And this is what I said about lesser magistrates. So in order to engage in just war, this isn't just a mob mentality. It has to be duly appointed authorities. And in the case of the colonies had representatives from each colony, and the colonies had to make independent decisions on whether or not they would join the revolution. So I do think they had that legitimate authority. The next is last resort. So you have just cause and intent, you have a legitimate authority, and then you have war as a last resort. War should always be a last resort. And then it comes down to this question of, did the colonists have any other choice? At the point where they declared independence, they knew they had no other options. The grievances they were sending to the king was unrelenting. There was no compromise, and England was preparing to put down the rebellion with armed force. So they really did not have another resort. A probability of success. This is interesting. And I think this one needs some thought. So even if we don't think of it as probability of success, we can think of it as a probability of achieving an end. So in other words, there's a just intent, but is war going to achieve that goal? So there has to be a clear goal in mind, and it has to be at least possible that engaging in armed conflict will help us get to a point where we bring about that intent. And so I think with the colonists, their goal was that they believed that armed resistance would eventually result in England realizing that they needed to give independence to the colonies. And the colonies, these founders, the men that signed the Declaration of Independence, they didn't want a war. That wasn't their goal. Their goal wasn't to start a war, but they were prepared to use armed force if they had to. And so when we think about this conflict, I do think they had a chance of success, and ultimately, praise God, they were successful. Now, another aspect of just war theory has to do with proportionality and discrimination. What we mean by proportionality and discrimination is this idea that we are not intentionally targeting the citizenry, that we're targeting combatants engaged in war, or we're targeting the means of making war on your enemy coming at you and making war on you. So we have some level of proportionality, and we have discrimination in our targeting and our means of war. So if we think about that, look at the way the colonists engaged in this battle. I mean, for American colonists, they were fighting on their own home soil. So there was their own families, their own towns that were put at risk, but this was a defensive war from that standpoint. And so I do think overall, if you look at the actions of the American colonists during this time period, it was proportional, and they did use discrimination in the targets they went after. So as we think about history, we can often, be forced into kind of taking sides, getting into extreme things, and not taking time to just understand what was happening in the moment, what our founders and the people that have come before us were thinking. But in the case of the Revolutionary War, I believe firmly, when viewed through the lens, a spiritual lens, as well as a lens of just war theory, you can celebrate and you can show gratitude for, you can be proud to be an American and proud of the stand and the actions that our founding fathers took when they engaged in the Revolutionary War. Hey, thanks for listening. Take care.